The ruins of the Reich still smouldered when the women were taken. They had walked out of a world shattered into ash, their uniforms frayed, their bellies hollow, their futures no longer tethered to any certainty. Surrender did not feel like release, it felt like walking into the mouth of the unknown. They had been told for years that capture meant degradation, brutality, perhaps worse. They had memorized the warnings whispered by propaganda, the lurid stories of enemies who would grind them into dust. And yet, when the steel doors of the transport clanged shut, and the train pulled away from the wreckage of Germany, none of them could imagine the strangeness of what truly awaited. Not chains, not hunger, not cruelty, but something almost unbearable in its simplicity, the shock of a bar of soap in their palms, the sting of hot water pouring down in abundance, the dissonance of kindness in the hands of the enemy. It was not freedom, but it was something that forced them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the world and about themselves. Before we step deeper into their journey, I want to ask you, if this story grips you, if you want to follow these women across oceans and into the paradox of captivity that revealed dignity, then I ask you to linger with us. Subscribe, share, let others discover this forgotten corner of history. It is not only their story, but a mirror of what war does to human beings, and how even in its darkest hours, humanity refuses to vanish. The war did not end with a trumpet call or a flag ceremoniously lowered. For these women, it ended with silence, a silence broken only by the crunch of boots over shattered glass, the faint hiss of smoke rising from what had once been homes, and the ragged coughs of a population too starved to resist. The Reich they had been told was eternal had collapsed into rubble. The very stones seemed to sag under the weight of defeat. Bridges lay broken across rivers, factories gutted, and in the doorways of ruined houses, children stared with the wide, hollow eyes of hunger. Against this backdrop of ruin, surrender felt less like an act and more like gravity, pulling everything down into the dust. They were young, most of them, hardly more than girls. Some had served in offices, their days filled with clerical tasks for the military machine. Others had been auxiliaries tending to the endless paperwork of a war gone mad. A few had been nurses, their hands stained with the futile labor of binding wounds that would never heal. They had not fired rifles, but they had belonged to the Reich all the same, swept into its machinery until its collapse spat them out into the open, defenseless and marked as enemies. When the Allied soldiers arrived, rifles slung across weary shoulders, the women stood in courtyards or on roadside ditches, clutching small bundles of belongings, eyes fixed to the ground. Fear was their constant companion. They remembered the warnings whispered into them by propaganda. Capture would mean degradation, the stripping away of all humanity. In secret, some had hidden blades, small enough to press against a wrist if things became unbearable. They braced for blows, for jeers, for the kind of treatment that war stories had promised. But the enemy soldiers only gestured, herding them toward gathering points with a stern but indifferent efficiency. No one struck them. No one spat on them. The absence of cruelty was almost disorienting. In the wreckage of their expectations, fear began to twist into confusion. Yet surrender stripped them of more than uniforms or assignments. It stripped them of certainty. For years, the Reich had told them who they were, what they fought for, what fate awaited the enemies of Germany. Now, in captivity, none of those words seemed anchored to reality. They walked in groups, guarded on either side, their boots raising faint clouds of dust over streets that had once been proud avenues. A bakery lay gutted, its signs swinging limply in the wind. A church's steeple had toppled sideways, bells buried under brick. The women passed these ruins as though moving through a dream, unable to reconcile the destruction with the fiery speeches they once heard on radios, promising victory. Some tried to hold themselves with dignity, their backs straight, eyes forward, as if posture alone could keep their world from unraveling. Others wept quietly, clutching one another like sisters, while still others moved with a kind of numbness, their minds blank from exhaustion and shock. Hunger gnawed at them constantly. Their stomachs had long since adapted to emptiness, but the ache of it made every step heavier. More than once, a woman stumbled, knees buckling, only to be pulled upright by the hands of those beside her. Solidarity was all they had left. Nightfall brought its own terrors. Huddled together under the watch of armed guards, they whispered about what tomorrow might bring. Would they be forced into labor camps? Would they vanish into cells, nameless and forgotten? Every creak of the dark seemed to sharpen their fears. They thought of their families, mothers trapped in cities reduced to ash, brothers lost to the front, fathers swallowed by silence. The Reich had collapsed, but its collapse had left them with nothing but questions. What haunted them most was not the certainty of punishment, but the void of not knowing. Each glance at the enemy's impassive faces deepened the mystery. Why no blows? Why no screams of vengeance? Why this almost mechanical efficiency that lacked both kindness and cruelty? In the absence of brutality, they felt something stranger, awaiting. It was as though they had stepped into a story whose script they had never read. For Anna, whose diary would become the thread of memory in years to come, the surrender felt like standing on the edge of a chasm. She wrote in cramped, hurried lines by the dim glow of a candle stub. The world has ended, but we are still alive. I do not know if this is mercy or punishment. We walk as ghosts. The soldiers do not speak to us. Their silence is worse than anger, for in it I hear no answer to what we have become. That sense of ghostliness clung to all of them. The surrender had not restored their humanity, but neither had it annihilated it. They floated between identities, no longer servants of the Reich, not yet prisoners of the enemy, suspended in an airless space where time itself seemed to hesitate. And so, when the order finally came to prepare for transport, when the guards signaled that they would be moved elsewhere, there was almost relief. At least movement promised definition. At least the unknown ahead, however terrifying, would end this purgatory of waiting, and thus they were led away from the ruins, leaving behind the shells of their cities and the shadows of what had been home. They carried nothing but their fear, their hunger, and the weight of lies they had once believed. Whatever awaited them lay far beyond the horizon. The trains came first, dark iron beasts that shrieked and groaned as they pulled the women away from the ruins of their homeland. The rattling cars smelled of rust and coal smoke, and each window was barred, offering only a fractured view of the collapsing world outside. Fields lay untended, their furrows empty. Villages looked hollow, shutters swinging in the wind, dogs barking at nothing. In the distance, skeletons of factories jutted against the sky like broken teeth. For the women, each passing image was both familiar and unbearable. A country that had consumed itself and left only bones behind. The journey seemed endless. They sat pressed shoulder to shoulder, their small bundles of belongings clutched tightly in their laps. Conversation was scarce, voices felt too heavy to lift. Hunger gnawed at them, sharper now than ever, for the meager rations they were given could not still the deep ache in their bellies. At times, the train slowed at sidings, and through the narrow slits they saw civilians scavenging through rubble, children fighting over scraps, old men stooped beneath the weight of firewood gathered from shattered houses. It was a vision of what awaited them, perhaps, if they were ever sent back. When at last the train stopped near a port, the women were herded out into the salty air. The sight of ships waiting in the harbour left them stunned. These were not the small, battered vessels of Germany's fading fleet. They were massive, steel-bodied giants, American ships built for the burden of war, now repurposed to carry the defeated. The women had heard rumours of prisoners being shipped away, but to see it was another matter. The ocean stretched out before them, endless and indifferent, a horizon that offered no hint of destination. Boarding was a blur of orders shouted in English, a language most of them barely understood, punctuated by the gestures of guards directing them up gangways. The decks smelled of tar, salt, and iron. Below, the holds were fitted with bunks, rows upon rows of canvas stretched taut on metal frames. It was confinement, yes, but not the darkness of dungeons they had imagined. The space was clean, almost austere, with air that carried the ceaseless rhythm of the sea. They were given blankets, thin but whole, and to their surprise, meals more filling than any they had seen in months, bread that was soft, butter that gleamed pale and rich, steaming bowls of stew whose fragrance made their stomachs twist with both hunger and disbelief. The voyage unfolded in a haze of routine. Guards watched them, but not with hatred. There was discipline, stern and impersonal, but not cruelty. Each day the women emerged briefly onto the open deck, the wind cutting against their faces, the sea stretching endlessly in all directions. For many, it was their first sight of the Atlantic, and its immensity unsettled them. The horizon was infinite, a boundaryless world that seemed to swallow not only geography but also the certainty of who they were. At night the ship rocked with the breathing of waves, and the women lay in their bunks whispering to one another in fragments. Some speculated about their destination, England perhaps, or some hidden camp in France. Others clung to darker fears that the ships were sailing them to their deaths, that the enemy had simply devised a slower, more calculated end. But then the next meal would come, hearty and strange in its abundance, and doubt would creep in. Why feed them if they were to be destroyed? Why grant blankets, showers of fresh water, the smallest comforts of dignity? Anna wrote again in her diary, her words pressed against the rocking of the ship. I cannot understand it. Each meal feels like a trick, a test of how long we will believe this illusion. I chew the bread, but my tongue waits for bitterness, for the taste of poison that does not come. The sea moves endlessly around us. I do not know if we are being carried to salvation or to another form of despair. Days blurred together, marked by the changing moods of the sea, sometimes calm as glass, sometimes heaving with storms that left the women clutching their stomachs in misery. The guards, though stern, offered buckets of water, brief reassurances in clipped words, small gestures that seemed almost human. Slowly, imperceptibly, the sharp edges of fear dulled into a restless anticipation. The moment that lingered most in memory was not the storms or the monotony of the crossing, but the first glimpse of land. On the horizon, faint against the morning mist, a shoreline appeared, vast, foreign, and impossibly distant from the ruins they had left behind. The women pressed against the railings, their eyes wide, hearts pounding. America. The word itself was heavy with contradictions. Enemy, liberator, destroyer, unknown. To step ashore would be to step not just into another country, but into another reality. As the ship drew closer, the air carried new scents of pine, of unfamiliar earth, of a land untouched by the bombs that had gutted their own. The women stood silent, their fear mingling now with awe, dread tangled with a flicker of something else they dared not name. Whatever awaited them on this foreign shore, it would no longer be shaped by the lies they had been told. It would be something altogether stranger. The gangplanks rattled under their boots as they descended into the blinding strangeness of America. After weeks at sea, their bodies unsteady from the rocking of the ship, the solid ground felt unreal, almost treacherous. The harbour stretched before them with a kind of immensity they had never seen in their ruined homeland. Cranes swinging overhead, warehouses stacked high with goods, trucks rumbling like impatient animals along the docks. Nothing bores the scars of war. The sky was vast and clean, the air filled not with smoke and ash, but with the tang of salt and gasoline. For the women, the sight of abundance was its own kind of shock. Their eyes searched for hunger, for wreckage, for the skeletal outlines of bombed-out cities. But instead they saw workers in crisp uniforms, barrels brimming with supplies, and streets that pulsed with life. They were gathered and loaded onto buses, long lines of them moving under the watch of guards. The soldiers were armed, yes, but there was no menace in their movements. They stood like sentinels performing a task, neither cruel nor careless, and their silence was different from the silence of surrender. It was not contemptuous, but procedural, a quietness that came from confidence rather than malice. The women sat pressed together on the benches of the bus, watching the unfamiliar landscapes rush past, green fields unscarred by shells, houses painted in bright colours, orchards heavy with fruit. The contrast was unbearable. Some turned their faces away, tears running silently down their cheeks, unable to reconcile this vision of prosperity with the starvation devouring their families across the ocean. When at last the buses turned into the gates of the camp, they braced themselves. Barbed wire stretched along the perimeter. Guard towers loomed, and the clang of the gates was a sound they had dreaded in nightmares. But inside, what they found was not the dungeon they had imagined. The barracks were orderly, rows of wooden buildings set along neat gravel paths. There were kitchens, laundry rooms, even gardens where vegetables grew in disciplined rows. The enemy had not built a place of torment, but something closer to a strange village contained within fences, and this discovery unsettled them more than cruelty would have. The orderlies directed them with gestures and clipped commands. Their first stop was not the barracks, but a building that smelled faintly of soap and steam. The women exchanged nervous glances. They understood. It was to be showers. Their hearts clenched with dread. They had heard the rumors whispered in hushed tones during the voyage, that showers in camps could mean death, that water would not flow but gas, that the enemy would deceive them with gentleness only to erase them utterly. Every step toward that building felt heavier, as though each pace carried them closer to annihilation. Inside, the tiled floors gleamed, the walls echoing with the hiss of pipes. The guards handed out small objects, pressing them into the women's palms. They looked down and froze. Soap, smooth, fragrant, absurdly clean. Some stared at it as though it were a weapon they did not know how to use. For years they had washed themselves in cold water with nothing but rags or slivers of grey, gritty substitutes. Now the enemy placed in their hands bars of ivory white, rich with scent, so slippery it seemed unreal. A wave of confusion swept over them, more terrifying in its gentleness than cruelty could ever have been. The water began to flow, first a hiss, then a rush, then streams cascading down from above in hot torrents. The women stepped beneath the showers, trembling, clutching their bars of soap, and then the heat struck them, the steam enveloped them, and the soap foamed into lather beneath their hands. For the first time in years their skin felt not caked with grime, but alive, scoured clean by a luxury they had forgotten existed. They rubbed the lather across their arms, their faces, their hair, the fragrance mingling with the steam until it became overwhelming. Some laughed, sudden and hysterical, their voices echoing against the tiles. Others wept silently, the tears mingling with the water streaming down their cheeks. Anna wrote later, "It was unbearable to feel such comfort. I wanted to fall to the floor, to cling to the tiles and beg for it never to end. The water was not mercy, it was shame. How could the enemy give us this when our own had left us? To filth and hunger, I could not reconcile it. I felt stripped bare, not of clothes, but of certainty." When they emerged, their skin flushed, their hair damp and clean, the world seemed altered. They felt both renewed and undone, as though the enemy had reached into their very identities and washed away the residue of the Reich along with the dirt of the journey, the soap, the water, the abundance of it all. It was not just kindness, it was confrontation. It forced them to face the fragility of what they had been told. And as they were led out into the camp, wrapped in the coarse but clean fabric of prison uniforms, they no longer knew whether they were prisoners or guests in a world that defied all they had believed. Life in the camp unfolded with a rhythm that was both alien and disorienting, ordinary. The women had braced themselves for humiliation, for labor that would grind their bones into dust, for the gnaw of perpetual hunger. Instead, each day began with the clang of a bell and the fragrance of food. Not scraps, not the bitter crusts they had scavenged in ruined Germany, but loaves of bread that were soft and white, steaming bowls of oatmeal, mugs of coffee whose dark aroma filled the mess hall with warmth. The first mornings felt like a trap, a trick meant to disarm them. They ate hesitantly, nibbling at the edges of bread, waiting for the lash of cruelty to follow. But it never came. The abundance was real. The women worked, yes, tasks in the kitchens, laundry, and fields within the fences, but the labor was measured, humane. There were rules, curfews, inspections, yet they were carried out with a stern efficiency that lacked malice. The guards did not jeer, they did not mock. They were present like the wooden posts of the fence itself, necessary but strangely impersonal. What struck the women most was not what was done to them, but what was not. The absence of cruelty became its own bewildering weight. In the evenings the camp softened, the air cooled, and the sounds of the day faded into the quiet chorus of crickets beyond the wire. Some women gathered to sing, their voices thin but steady, weaving old folk songs into the night. Others wrote letters they were told might reach their families, though many doubted the words would find their way across the Atlantic. Anna's diary grew thicker, her cramped script recording not only events but the confusion of living in a place where the enemy treated them with more dignity than the Reich ever had. The food was the cruelest kindness of all. Every spoonful of stew thick with potatoes and meat carried with it the image of their homeland, of mothers standing in endless bread lines, of children scraping soot from chimneys to fill their bellies. To eat well while their families starved felt like betrayal. Some women forced themselves to leave food uneaten, as if refusal could balance the scales of guilt. Others wept silently as they swallowed, torn between gratitude and shame. The Reich had promised honor through sacrifice, yet here, in captivity, they were nourished. The irony was unbearable. Even leisure carried dissonance. The Americans allowed them access to books, to music, even to classes in language or crafts. For some it was a balm, a way to pass the endless hours. For others it was torment. How could they sit in a room learning English words when their own language was buried under rubble? How could they string beads into necklaces while the world they knew lay in ashes? Yet the activities continued, offered with the same strange generosity that threaded through every part of camp life. Rumors drifted through the barracks, whispered at night when the guards' footsteps faded. Some said the Americans wanted to re-educate them, to turn them against their homeland. Others believed it was psychological warfare, that kindness itself was a weapon. A few dared to wonder if it was simply humanity, but that thought was the most dangerous of all. If the enemy was capable of humanity, then what did that mean for everything the Reich had preached? The women wrestled with themselves in silence. Gratitude warred with resentment, shame with relief, suspicion with wonder. Each act of unexpected dignity unraveled the web of lies they had once believed, but the unraveling left them raw, uncertain of who they were. Were they enemies, victims, survivors? The fence kept them confined, but the greater prison was the identity crisis beating within their chests. Anna captured it in her diary with aching clarity. I do not know what to feel anymore. The bread in my hand is soft, warm, alive. I eat it, and my body thanks me, but my heart despises me. If this is the enemy, then who was our ally? If captivity brings more dignity than freedom in Germany, then perhaps we were captives long before the wire enclosed us. The nights stretched long, filled with dreams that tangled hunger, fear, and the scent of soap that still lingered on their skin. Dawn would break, another bell would clang, and another day would unfold in this paradox of captivity that nourished even as it wounded. And beneath it all, whispers of change began to circulate. Rumors that this strange life was not permanent, that repatriation might soon come. The very word carried both hope and dread, for to return meant not only to face the ruins of their homeland, but to decide what kind of truth they would carry back with them. The first hints of departure came not as announcements, but as murmurs. A guard mentioning new orders, a kitchen worker overhearing the officers' clipped conversations, a letter intercepted carrying whispers of ships soon to sail eastward. At first, the women dismissed it as idle talk, the kind of rumor that grows in confinement to fill the emptiness of days. But as weeks stretched into months, the whispers hardened into something tangible: repatriation. The word carried the sharpness of a blade, slicing through the fragile sense of stability they had built inside the fences. For many, the thought of returning home ignited hope. To step again on German soil, to search the ruins for loved ones, to reclaim even a fragment of the life left behind. That was a dream that burned brightly. Yet hope was inseparable from dread. They knew what awaited across the ocean: starvation, rubble, the gaze of neighbors who might not welcome them back, but condemn them for having survived captivity when so many had perished. To go home was to walk back into absence, to trade abundance for hunger, dignity for judgment. The paradox gnawed at them in the final weeks. Each meal became sharper in its sweetness. Every loaf of bread a reminder of what would be lost. The showers they once feared became moments of quiet reverence, their skin drinking in the hot water as though trying to memorize its touch. Even the orderly roll calls and the measured footsteps of guards seemed, in hindsight, a strange comfort. Captivity had been a cage, yes, but within its bars there had been structure, food, and the disarming presence of humanity. What awaited them was freedom laced with ruin. At night, the barracks filled with whispered debates. Some argued that to return was duty, that Germany, broken though it was, remained their home. Others confessed they wished the Americans would keep them, that they could live and work quietly in this strange land where war seemed a distant echo. A few wondered if the kindness they had seen was not kindness at all, but a veneer that would dissolve the moment they left. Suspicion still lived in their bones, too deeply rooted to be washed away even by soap and bread. Anna's diary grew restless in these final days. "I do not know who I am anymore," she wrote. "We have lived like guests in a world that should hate us. I feel both grateful and guilty, cleansed and stained. To go home is to face the eyes of those who suffered while we were fed. Will they see us as traitors, as women who found comfort in the arms of the enemy? Or will they know that survival is never simple, that captivity is its own form of war? The morning of departure came with a suddenness that left little time for reflection. The women were lined up, their bundles small but heavier now with the memories they carried. The gates swung open and buses rumbled once more toward the harbour. The air was sharp with autumn, carrying the smell of wood smoke and salt. The ships waited, their hulls looming like dark thresholds. For many, stepping aboard felt like reliving the first voyage, but the fear was tempered now by knowledge. There would be no poison, no hidden cruelty, only the long stretch of ocean and the uncertainty of what lay on its far side. As the shoreline of America receded into mist, the women crowded the rails. Some gazed silently, burning the image of abundance into their minds, as though it might sustain them in the lean years to come. Others turned their backs, unwilling to carry the weight of contrast any longer. The ocean stretched once again in all directions, but this time the horizon was not a symbol of escape into the unknown. It was a return into the wreckage of what once had been home. They whispered to one another, voices trembling with equal parts fear and resolve. What stories would they tell upon their return? Would they speak of soap and showers, of bread and stew, of guards who treated them not as vermin, but as human beings? Or would they bury those memories deep, smothered beneath silence, afraid that the truth itself might sound like betrayal? Survival had not given them clarity, it had given them questions without answers. And so the journey ended not with closure, but with dissonance, the women suspended between two worlds, the ruins of the Reich that had lied to them, and the strange mercy of the enemy that had upended those lies. The Atlantic roared beneath them, vast and indifferent, carrying them toward a homeland that was no longer home. What lingered was not certainty, but the haunting weight of paradox, that in the enemy's hands they had found dignity, and in their own nation's embrace they might find only hunger and ash.